Hi everyone, welcome to SBS 304 Research Methods. Today we're going to talk about interviewing, but first I want to talk about some front matter. So I want us to think about what we've learned over the semester since we're coming to a close here. Week 1 we had an introduction. Week 2 we learned what social science research was. Week 3 we learned about research ethics. Week 4 we learned how to pose research questions and state hypotheses. Week 5 we learned about operationalizing and measuring variables. Week 6 we learned about sampling strategies. Week 7 we had an exam. Week 8 we learned about survey research, and week 9 we learned about experimental research. So this week, week 10, we're going to learn about interview research, but we're almost finished with the semester. We've also done a lot of work this semester. You've completed a topic proposal. You've thought about the sample you want to use for your senior research. You've designed a survey. You have completed your ethics training, or you're working on completing that. And most of you have completed an annotated bibliography. You've conducted literature research related to your topic. You've actually done quite a lot. I know this semester has felt really scattered and confused. And part of that is a feature of my never having taught online before. Part of it is a feature of being in a global pandemic and everything being pretty scattered and confused. But I just want to point out that we've actually done quite a bit of work together this semester. However, I'd like to do a little bit of a check-in as we kind of bring things to a close. So I'd like to do two things. First, I'd like you to complete an anonymous survey, which I've linked in the lecture slides, which are on Moodle. I'd like you to tell me what is the most important or interesting thing you've learned. What is the biggest question you have now? What is one thing you did well? What is one thing you could have done better? What is one thing I did well? And what is one thing I could have done better? I want you to answer these questions thinking of the course as a whole. Finally, I'd like you to schedule appointments with me. Some of you have been doing this consistently all along, and those students seem to be having a pretty easy time with the course. Some of you have not made an appointment with me yet, and I would really like to hear from you. So I'd like you to use my calendar app, which I've linked in the slides, to schedule a 5 to 30-minute appointment with me. So you can choose a 5-minute, a 15-minute, or a 30-minute appointment. Your choice. We'll conduct these meetings via Teams, and we'll just do a brief check-in about your course project. Since meetings are not anonymous, and I'll know who you are, I'll be able to award you 5 bonus points on your literature review assignment if you schedule a meeting with me between now and the end of the semester. So today we're going to talk about in-depth interviewing. In-depth interviewing is a qualitative process. Remember we talked about quantitative being about counts, how much or how many or to what extent. Qualitative comes from the Latin qualia, and it means, what is it like? What is it like to live an experience? What is it like to live through a period of time? What is it like to be you? Qualitative research, like interviews, tend to focus on open-ended questions. So instead of questions with preset answer choices like you have in a survey, you want to ask for stories and narratives. So you want to ask questions that get people talking, that get people to tell you about themselves, about their lives, about their thoughts and experiences, not just select an answer from a list. The goal of in-depth interview research is to elicit as much detail as possible about the topics you want to know about. So you're hoping to get interviewees talking and telling you really rich, detailed stories about their experiences and their lives. We can consider focus groups to be a type of in-depth interviewing, but I'm going to focus on on one-on-one individual interviews here. The reason I'm going to do that instead of focusing on focus groups is because focus groups are a very particular kind of interviewing research, and they require some very specialized training. So we don't have time in this course, or much less in this lecture, to really get into how focus groups work and give you a good overview of focus groups. There are multiple strategies and reams of research on best practices for focus groups. I just don't think in this course we can do focus groups any justice. So I'm going to focus on individual interviews for now. So the types of in-depth interview that we think about are structured, semi-structured, and unstructured. Structured interviews are just when you give a person a survey and you serve as an interviewer. So this is when there's a survey instrument like the one you designed for lab exercise 3, and you literally just help the respondent answer the survey. Structured interviews use closed-ended questions with preset answer choices. This is not really what we mean by in-depth interviewing most of the time. What we generally mean by in-depth interviewing are semi-structured and unstructured research. So semi-structured interviews involve a planned list of questions, which we call an interview schedule. It's called a schedule because the questions are arranged in a particular way. They're arranged in an order on purpose, designed to get the best information from respondents. Semi-structured interviews use open-ended questions and include probes for more detail and further information. We'll talk more about what that looks like later, but in essence, you ask an open-ended question that would tend to give a narrative response, and then you ask short follow-up questions designed to elicit more detail. Finally, there are unstructured interviews. In an unstructured interview, you may not have an interview schedule at all, and if you do, it's just a broad list of topics. You may have a list of general questions or prompts that you want a respondent to talk about, and the interview will be very conversational in nature. You'll have a list of topics or prompts, and you'll just have a long conversation with the interviewer with the goal of with the respondent, with the goal of getting the respondent to talk as much as possible. So, some types of interviews you might conduct. Oral histories are unstructured interviews with the goal of collecting as much detailed information as possible about a person's experience with a particular moment, event, experience, or time in history. The goal is to preserve the experience of one person. And again, they tend to focus on a moment or event. We'll talk more about that in a moment. But an example is the ACT UP Oral History Project. So the ACT UP movement was an AIDS activism movement that took place in the 80s and 90s to combat the AIDS epidemic and provide mutual aid to people suffering from and living with HIV/AIDS. So what happened is this social movement fought for treatments and hospice care and medical care and civil rights for people living with HIV/AIDS, and they did a terrific job. And when they were finished, the movement died down. But since it was an HIV/AIDS activism movement, a lot of the people who were active in the movement were HIV positive themselves. So by the mid-2000s, a lot of them were starting to die from HIV/AIDS or from other diseases. Some of them had been older to begin with and were just starting to get really elderly and die of natural causes. So some oral historians decided to collect the stories of as many people involved with ACT UP as they could. And I've linked to this oral history project in the interview or in the lecture slides. So you can actually, but you can also just Google it, and you can actually look at interview transcripts and sometimes video recordings of interviews with people who are active in the ACT UP movement in the 80s and 90s. And you can see an example of what an oral history looks like. Life histories are different from oral histories. Where oral histories focus on the period or event in history, life histories focus on the sequences of events in a human life course. So they're usually semi-structured or unstructured interviews that focus on how events unfolded throughout a human's lifetime. And unlike oral histories, the purpose is not simple preservation of the story. The purpose is to compare and analyze these narratives for research. So an example would be the 7-Up project. It has nothing to do with the soft drink. A researcher in Great Britain, who was actually working for a television station at the time, had the idea to interview 14 children at age 7, and then interview them every 7 years ongoing for the rest of their lives. So it's a large panel study. Well, it's actually a small panel study because it uses a small sample, but the goal at each stage is to get a life history, to interview folks about how events unfolded in their lives. Finally, we can think about cognitive interviews. These are structured or semi-structured interviews in which respondents are asked to think out loud about particular questions or survey items that the researchers are trying to pilot test. So if you want to know if a standardized math test is going to work, one thing you could do is ask people who are good at math to talk through the problem, to think out loud as they solve the problem, to let you know how people perceive the questions. The goal is to collect as much detailed information on the thought process surrounding a test or survey or question as possible. So the goal is to get people to talk you through how they would respond to a stimulus, usually a test question or survey item. We're going to spend the bulk of today's lecture talking about how to conduct an interview study. We're going to talk about sampling, designing an interview schedule, and conducting interviews. We're also going to give a little time to analysis. So, when we think about sampling, there are two kinds of people we may want to sample. The first kind of people we may want to sample are informants. Informants are basically folks with specialized knowledge about our topic. They may be experts in the field, they may be leaders in a movement, or they may just be insiders in a social scene. So, I do research on religion and mental health. If I wanted to understand the way that church congregations handle mental illness and frame mental illness, I might want to interview a lot of different kinds of people. One kind of person I might want to interview is the pastoral staff. I may want to interview anybody who's involved in kind of pastoral counseling. That is when pastors sit down with their congregants and talk to them about what's going on in their lives and help them solve problems or think through crises. These pastors or members of the pastoral staff would be informants. They have specialized knowledge about the working of the church and how the church handles mental health and mental illness because of their position. They're leaders. They're also insiders. They're members of the church. In fact, they're the leaders of the church. So they have inside knowledge about the church, and they're also leaders of the church. So those folks would be considered informants. I may also want to do interviews with people who are respondents. That is, ordinary people who have knowledge of a subject or are connected with a subject, but don't necessarily have any special expert knowledge. Here, in the example of mental health in a church, I might want to interview congregants and just ask them, if you had a mental health challenge, how would you deal with it at church? How would you expect the church to respond? Who would you talk to? Um, there's no more benefit in talking to informants versus respondents. It just depends on what kind of knowledge you're trying to gain and who's going to have that knowledge. Informants used to be seen as kind of elite respondents, and that paradigm has kind of shifted. We no longer tend to think of informants as more valuable than kind of quote unquote ordinary respondents. We now just see them as providing a different kind of information. A time when informants may be really helpful is when you're trying to gain access to a social scene that you're not part of. It may be really useful to connect with an insider in that social scene who can help you gain entree or access. But ordinary folks with knowledge of a subject are likely to represent a wider variety of perspectives and have a range of knowledge of the subject compared with informants who are likely to have specialized knowledge. So, respondent information is no less valuable, and in fact, most of the interviews you do will be with people who would be considered respondents. So, when you sample for in-depth interview research, you're generally not using a probability sample, although we'll talk about some times when you might. You're generally using purposive sampling with no attempt to construct a representative sample, and you're usually using what's called case study logic, where you seek to understand each person or case on their own terms and not view them as representatives of a population. So the goal is not to create a sample from which we can generalize to a population. The goal is to collect a number of cases that will elucidate a situation, phenomenon, or question for us. One way we can do this, apply case study logic and gain a sample or build a sample, is with snowball sampling. This is a very popular way to sample for in-depth interview research. It's when you start with one respondent or informant, and then after interviewing them, you ask them to recommend one or more other respondents or informants who can help you complete your study. This is a great way to find people who meet criteria for your study and who are willing to participate. However, it can produce a relatively limited sample. For example, people who know each other are likely to be similar in important ways, and your sample is unlikely to be representative of any larger population. But if you're using purposive sampling, it isn't going to be anyway. So when I say that people who know each other are likely to be similar in important ways, if you asked me to participate in a study on politics, and then you asked me to recommend other people who could also participate in a study on politics, most of the people I recommended would have politics pretty similar to my own, because people with similar political views tend to be friends with each other. I happen to know a lot of people who have very different political views from me, but they may not be the first people who would come to my mind. They're not necessarily my closest friends and associates. They're more just like people I know. So I might recommend them, but most of the people who you would get to respond based on a recommendation from me are pretty likely to be similar to me in politics. So you may end up with a really lopsided sample, which is why it can be useful to snowball from multiple respondents or informants. So, when you're determining the number of interviews you want to do, this is something we talked about in chapter 6. Um, you can proceed by having a set number of interviews at the outset that you want to accomplish, and then just sampling until you accomplish that number of cases. So, you could base this on population size. If I wanted to do in depth interviews at Birmingham Southern College about the experience of being an undergraduate student at Birmingham Southern College, I might get a sampling frame from Barbara Brown in Academic Records of all students enrolled at Birmingham Southern College, figure out that there are about 1,300 of you, and decide that if I interviewed 130 of you, that would be 10% of the population and probably a pretty good sample. However, interviewing 130 people might be pretty expensive. I might not have enough time or enough money to interview 130 students. So, based on study resources, I might decide that 70 is enough or 65. I might only do so many interviews because I don't have the resources to do more. Resources here can mean money, but it more often means time and energy. In-depth interviews are very energy expensive. They take a lot of researchers' time to complete. There's some incentive to have only one researcher or two researchers conducting interviews at a time. And it can take a really long time to complete. So sometimes there's an incentive to limit the number of cases. But that's not always a problem. Most of the time in interview studies, you reach saturation at a certain point. And this is another way you could know that you've sampled enough people. Again, we talked about this a little bit in chapter 6, but you know you've reached saturation when no new information is emerging, and when each additional respondent is really just repeating themes that have already been generated by previous respondents. So when you are no longer gaining new insights, new themes, new groupings, you may realize that you're finished, and that's okay. Finally, there are mixed method samples. This is becoming increasingly common. Mixed methods is just a research study that includes more than one method of study. So it could, for example, include a survey and in-depth interviews, or it could include a survey and an experiment. Mixed methods are becoming popular. They've been popular since I was in graduate school. And the goal of mixed method studies is to increase validity by gaining multiple kinds of knowledge about a subject. So, a mixed method sample would be when you survey a large number of people and then follow up with interviews with a small subset of those people. So if I surveyed 3,000 people from a probability sample, I might then do a purposive sample or a probability sample of anywhere from 100 to 300 people and interview those people about the subject, particularly about key questions that were involved in the survey to get more in-depth knowledge about those experiences. So in that case, instead of a purposive sample, I could actually have a small probability sample. Next, let's talk about designing an interview schedule. So to design an interview schedule, remember that this is your list of questions that you're going to ask your respondents or informants. You want to begin in a very open-ended, almost brainstorming kind of a way by writing down everything you want to know without self-editing. You want to write down the knowledge you hope to gain, the questions you want answers to, in whatever ways they occur to you. These are not the questions you're ultimately going to ask. You're going to want to refine these questions and think them through and reword them carefully. But for now, just get down what you want to know. Next, you'll want to organize the questions by broad topic or theme. You want to group similar questions together and begin thinking about question ordering. What do you want to know about first? Why is it important to know about this first and this next? And finally, you'll want to edit your questions very carefully. Just like with survey questions, you want to make sure you're using clear language free of jargon. You want to make sure that your meaning is clear, that someone reading the question or hearing the question will understand what you meant by it. You want to make sure that your questions are not leading, that you're not eliciting a particular kind of response or encouraging the respondent to agree with your preconceived notions. And finally, you want to avoid loaded language or loaded terms. So, if I wanted to know whether someone had sex for money, I wouldn't say, "Are you a hooker?" I would say, "Has there ever been a time when you exchanged sex for money?" Hooker is a loaded term. It can cause an emotional reaction. Instead of that, I would ask specifically what I meant in the most value neutral terms possible. That brings us to the next point, which is how to frame questions to get respondents talking and keep them talking. So, the first and most important thing you want to do is ask open ended questions that are going to ask for stories and not definite answers. So, none of your questions should be answerable in one word. As few as possible should be answerable in one sentence. I shouldn't ask questions like, "How old were you when this happened?" I should ask, "What was going on with you around the time that this event took place?" I should ask, "Tell me about your life when this event took place." Avoid judgmental language. I've asked for stories. Now, the easiest way to shut down a story is to let someone know that you don't really want their story. If you're asking someone to tell you a story, especially a story that's personal and meaningful to them, you want to avoid any language that's going to sound judgmental at any stage in the interview. So, you don't want to ask, "Did you abuse the animal?" You want to ask, "So when these things were happening to you, how did you interact with the pets in the house?" You want to ask a question that asks for a story. How did you interact with the pets in the house? That's not a one-word answer. And you want to avoid judgmental language. Notice I didn't say, "Did you harm animals?" I didn't say, "Did you kick the dog?" I said, "How did you interact?" So I use this not to sensationalize you or scandalize you. I use the example of animal abuse because it's something that we all have a visceral reaction to. It's something where the natural way to ask about it that occurs to most of us is to use judgmental language. Most of us would consider harming an animal especially terrible. So when we ask about it, using neutral language is not natural. But we have to be careful to avoid using judgmental language because it will shut down stories. That includes normalizing problematic behaviors. So, one way to do this is not to ask if someone engaged in a problematic behavior, but rather ask, when did they do it? Or how did they do it? Or what were the circumstances surrounding it? So instead of asking someone, "Do you use drugs?" I might ask someone, "What drugs do you like to use?" Instead of asking someone, um, "Do you steal?" I would ask someone, most children shoplift at some point in their lives. Do you remember a time that you shoplifted? Can you tell me about that? Um, so, normalizing problematic behaviors is an important tool for eliciting stories. Now, do you agree with the behaviors in your heart? You don't have to. Um, I would personally feel really scandalized if someone were telling me a story about abusing an animal. This would be very difficult for me to hear, but you want to avoid appearing judgmental at any point during the interview. So um, you can build in probes for further information, and you can often disguise kind of distaste or surprise as curiosity and interest. So you can approach difficult discussions by just saying, I'm going to learn as much as I can. And when someone describes a problematic behavior, you can say, interesting, tell me more about that. Or, oh, what was happening just before you did that? Or, I've I'm not sure I understand what you mean when you say blank. Could you describe what you mean? Um, Let me go back to when you said you did this. Tell me more about that. So often, uh, when we react strongly to something, we have to kind of neutralize our emotional response and avoid using judgmental reactions and instead insert kind of curiosity. This is difficult, but becomes much easier with practice. So, I have personally conducted interviews with street children who have been through some really difficult things. And part of that experience was listening to stories about child harm from children and sometimes from adults. And it was very difficult for me not to listen, not to react negatively, not to cry, not to hug the children and say, oh, you poor thing, it's so awful that happened. But when you do that, not only do you shut them down talking about it, you can also risk re traumatizing somebody. It becomes an ethical concern because you can risk inspiring shame or inspiring sadness on an event that someone else perceives as somewhat neutral. Or worse, you can kind of layer your negative emotions on top of the negative emotions that someone else is already experiencing. So be careful to manage emotions when actually conducting interviews. So when you conduct the interview, you want to know your interview schedule well before you ever begin asking questions of a respondent. You want to know what you're trying to get out of it. This will help you to keep the interview on track and keep the interview guided without having to constantly look at your notes and go, let's see what comes next. It will allow you to keep the conversation flowing. You want to allow plenty of time, especially for your first few interviews. At first, you don't know what to ask. You don't know which questions are going to elicit a lot of useful information and which questions are going to prove to be pretty fruitless. So at first, you want to allow really plenty of time to learn how to conduct the interviews for this study. The last thing you want to do is get midway through the interview schedule and have the respondent really engaged and telling you great information and have to be like, oh, I'm sorry, I have to get to my next meeting. That's not a good look. Don't do that. Always record the interview if possible. This is especially useful because you're going to transcribe. The book gives you lots of advice for how to record with like a digital recorder. But in the age of COVID, we're doing most of our interviews virtually anyway, and increasingly that's very common. So when you record interviews, you can usually use the app you're using to record. You can also record on your phone. The important thing is to make sure your tools are working. Do a sound check before you start recording, before you start the interview. Make sure technology is on your side. It's a good idea to take notes even while you're recording. Part of this is so that you can write field notes during the interview, so that you can highlight important things that you want to come back to. But it's also performative. if somebody's writing down what you're saying, it makes you feel that it's important. So part of note taking is performative. It also gives you a space to process some thoughts or emotions that may be coming up for you in a way that appears neutral to the others, to the respondent. So you want to write field notes during and after the interview. You want to write down observations other than what the respondent is telling you. So maybe the respondent is late and seems flustered. Maybe the respondent is using really closed body language throughout the interview. Maybe the respondent tells you one thing but seems really shifty or concerned about it and is being evasive. And so on paper or on the transcript, it looks like they're telling you one thing, but you notice that they may mean something else. Are there other factors affecting the interview? Do you sense that the respondent doesn't like you? Do you sense that the respondent is uncomfortable with the line of questioning? Are there other people around who might be making the respondent nervous? Is it loud in the room where you are so you're having difficulty understanding each other? This is important to write down. So how do we analyze in-depth interview research? We start by transcribing. This is every in-depth interview researcher's least favorite part. You start by transcribing. You transcribe the interview recording word for word. There are a lot of apps that will use voice to text to do approximate recordings or approximate transcriptions for you, but it's important to proofread them. Then you want to do what's called coding. This is the main process for analyzing in-depth interview research. And what it is when you look through the transcripts of an interview and look for themes. So you want to decide right away whether you're using deductive coding or inductive coding. Deductive coding is when you have identified keywords or themes or variables or ideas that you want to measure. And then you go through the interview transcripts and look for instances of those themes, ideas, keywords, etc. Inductive coding is more what we think of with inductive research. We're looking for themes. We're looking for what emerges. We read and reread our transcripts to identify patterns in responses. We see what ideas come up over and over and over. And later, we recode to refine, combine, and eliminate specific codes. What I mean by that is, you may think that one theme is emerging, but you realize that it's actually a couple of different themes that you've wrongly bundled into one. So you may realize that when people talk about beauty culture, some of them are talking about fashion and some of them are talking about grooming. So you could split that code. You could also realize that you've thought of two related ideas as separate codes, but really they're about the same idea. In that case, you could combine the codes. And finally, you may realize that a couple of codes come up once or twice, but they don't really have anything to do with your research, and they're not very important, so you might eliminate those codes. So you code and then you recode. And this is the main process for analyzing in-depth interview research. So I'm going to post a video tomorrow about demonstrating some interviewing techniques. But in the meantime, I want us to look forward to the rest of the semester. I want us to focus on catching up, turning in Lab 5, completing Exam 2, and working on our literature review assignment. So, catching up. If you haven't turned in Lab 4 and your annotated bibliography yet, please do so right away. and email or schedule a meeting with me if you're having trouble. If you're missing work before Lab 4, like going back to Lab 3 or Lab 2 or Exam 1, please email me to discuss that. Lab 5 is due November 4th. It looks difficult, but I think with Teams and Zoom, it's not going to be that hard. What I want you to do is complete 3 in-depth interviews related to your research topic. I say related to your topic because they don't have to directly address your research question. You don't need to produce usable data for your senior research through this exercise. The point of this exercise is to teach you how to do in-depth interview research and let you practice. Some of you are not going to be doing in-depth interviews for your senior research. So this is really just an exercise in case you go to graduate school in sociology or political science or a related field, and you need to know how to do in-depth interviews. The goal is not to produce usable data. I want you to conduct all interviews virtually using Teams, Zoom, FaceTime, or similar technology. I don't want you to be person to person with whomever you're interviewing for your safety and their safety. Record with consent. So make sure that the person knows you're recording and has your permission to record. And I expect each interview to last about 15 to 30 minutes. Because I'm a kind and generous professor, I'm not going to require you to transcribe these interviews. That would actually take many hours of work. A 30-minute interview takes about 2.5 hours to transcribe. So I'm not going to ask you to do that. I am going to ask you to listen and watch back the recordings, identify themes, and then use those to answer the lab exercise questions. Along with the lab exercise questions, I'll ask you to submit the interview schedule you used. If you didn't use an interview schedule, if you used an unstructured interview methodology, I would like you to provide your list of topics and a couple of notes about each topic, why they relate to your research, why you chose them. So 2 or 3 sentences about each topic if you just provide a list of topics, so that they make sense to me when I'm grading them. And that is all I have to say about Lab 5 for now. Exam 2 is going to be given on November 5th, which is a Thursday. It's only going to cover weeks 8, 9, and 10. However, while it's not cumulative, it will build on concepts taught at the beginning of the course. So I'm not going to ask you specific questions that were covered on Exam 1, but I am going to ask you about ideas you learned before Exam 1. The exam may be a little shorter than the first exam, but it'll still be worth 100 points, which probably just means I'll zero the exam out for more points. I probably won't make each question count for more. It will be the same testing procedures as Exam 1. It will be posted on Moodle and emailed to you at 7 a.m. You'll have until 5 p.m. to complete it. If you can't take the exam within that window, I need you to get in touch with me ahead of time and let me know, unless you're very ill, in which case you can let me know afterward. But if you're healthy enough, I would like you to get in touch with me before the exam to let me know. It will be an individual effort. I've heard a rumor going around that my exams are open note. You should know that they are not open note. They are not open note, they are not open book, they are not open lecture slide, they are not open anything. I expect you to take the exam based on what you know already. I will be holding 2 review sessions for this exam instead of 1. One on Tuesday, November 3rd, and one on Wednesday, November 4th. This is because some of you need Tuesday, November 3rd to vote. I understand that not everyone can vote or wants to vote, and some of you have already voted by mail or voted early. So I'm still holding the scheduled review session on November 3rd. but I'm also holding a separate review session at 2 p.m. on November 4th to let everyone join in and have an opportunity who needs November 3rd to go vote in person. Next, let's talk about the literature review project. The literature review project is due on November 19th, which is the last day of the course. And it differs from your annotated bibliography in some important ways. It's not just a list of sources or a summary of sources. It's a cohesive analysis of the sources you reviewed for your annotated bibliography. And it should take the form of an essay in which you discuss the major themes in the literature, the important theoretical paradigms that are used to discuss your topic, and what unanswered questions emerge in the literature, focusing on how your research will contribute to those unanswered questions. I want your literature review to be approximately 8 pages long in a 12-point font, double-spaced, and you should include a full reference list in a standard style. So I don't really care if you use APA, ASA, MLA, Chicago, as long as it's consistent and formal, I'm okay with it. The point is that I should be able to look at your reference list and find your sources. So I'll be posting full instructions for this assignment shortly, but just know that you need to be looking through your annotated bibliography sources and organizing it by theme, looking for important theoretical paradigms, and identifying unanswered questions. And that is all I have to say to you today. Look forward to that demonstration video tomorrow. And the review sheet for exam 2 will be posted on Moodle and emailed to you by Thursday. Please, as always, email me if you have any questions, schedule a meeting with me if necessary, and let me hear from you.